So I've been working as a perinatal psychiatrist for quite a few years now, and I want to tell you something about it. I want to tell you something about perinatal mental health. I want to tell you something about the epidemiology, as in how common it is. I want to talk about stigma mainly in terms of barriers to seeking treatment, because luckily some of the amazing speakers who've come before me have talked about other sorts of barriers, which applies equally well to mental illness. And I want to give you the very hopeful story of providing mental health services in the UK with some thoughts about what we should be doing elsewhere. All right, so the title of my talk actually refers to a kid's book that I loved when mine were little, called A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. I don't know whether anybody knows it. It's by a Japanese person, I think, called Hitoshi. So anyway, it doesn't matter. Oh, I'm sorry, that's telling me to finish. That's wrong. No. What do I do? Surely it's not over already. I've barely started. Right, the point being that postnatal depression covers a multitude of sins. As a clinician sitting in an outpatient department, if someone tells me that their mother may have had a touch of postnatal depression, I am aware that the woman in front of me may not know what it was that her mum had experienced, because it is such a difficult thing for people to talk about. It might have been obsessive compulsive disorder, it might have been something much more serious like a psychotic illness, or it may well have been anxiety or depression in the perinatal period. Basically, anything that happens when you're not expecting a baby or haven't just had a baby can happen at that time as well. It's just that it can look quite different. I don't know how to stop this. What am I going to do? It's driving me absolutely mad. Can I pass it to someone and just tell you to shut up? And it hasn't got a sort of Alexa thing to go, Alexa, shut up. So, the point is that anything can happen in the perinatal period as at any time in a woman's life, but often the clinical presentation is quite unique, actually, during this time. And because I'm aiming to finish in under my allotted 20 minutes, but not in 2, I'm not going to talk you through all the different diagnostic groups and what they look like now. I'm hoping that we can come back when there's a bit of time for questions to the things that people want to come back to. But I suppose the bottom line of this slide is that there are specific features, that sometimes these specific features involve the baby, which, is something that we always need to be thinking about, and that, therefore our management needs to incorporate a much wider social network than just mum. But, we need to be on the lookout for this. Specialised services are worthwhile. That's the point about this slide. We do need specialised services. Even though, as an adult general psychiatrist, we are all treating women in the perinatal period. And this has been part of the political controversy about funding specialised services, because actually everybody needs to know some of this stuff. Nevertheless, there is a good argument for the services that we've been campaigning very hard to develop. The prevalence of our disorders is high, okay? So in 2017, 679 babies were born approximately. And if you think that out of those short of 700,000 babies, there's a prevalence of 3% of postpartum psychosis, which is the most severe end, really, of the conditions that we look after in the perinatal period. That's 2,000 women in England and Wales. It's not a small number. Pictorially, though, you can see at the bottom of that the number of women experiencing milder conditions, adjustment disorders and distress, milder forms of depression and anxiety, number about 150,000. So that's very, very common. 1 in 6 women having a baby will experience a problem with their mental health. It might not reach the level at which they need a specialist service, but nevertheless, this is something that is impacting on an awful lot of women. And when I was thinking about preparing for this talk and thinking about how scary the audience is, because it's so broad, so experienced, and just very diverse, I was thinking also about the impact on the workplace. I was thinking about the number of people here for Leigh Day, of whom people will be having babies and having time off, and how difficult it might be if somebody is experiencing a milder form of problem for which they feel anxious about seeking help because of the stigma. That actually is me and my first one. And the reason I put that picture on was to remind us all that it could be any of us that these things happen to. Not only is it common, but it, in some cases, not me, but this is a woman called Daksha Emson. Now, I sort of now I've given up looking at audiences and wondering how many people have heard about her, because unfortunately it's less of us know about her now because it's now a little while ago. But Daksha, this woman who tragically died in the year 2000, was a consultant psychiatrist, so she really was like me in other ways, and she developed a postpartum psychosis, a relapse actually of her pre-existing bipolar disorder. And there's a few, is there anybody, just nod or put your hand up or something if you know this story, just because it is an absolutely terrible story. I'm not going to go into, a few people might have heard. I won't go into the details, but it's basically appalling. And this is a woman who got firsts as a medical student. She qualified in medicine, she became a psychiatrist, she had a bipolar disorder, which is a condition that is remitting, relapsing, and so there's full, you regain full functioning in between episodes of depression or mania. So she was basically doing fine, but she was at risk of relapsing after having a baby, and she did, and she died, and so did her baby. All right. So obviously, not treating these conditions is massively risky, all right? But as we've been talking about all afternoon already, treatment doesn't come without risk either. So the thing about a specialist service is that we are constantly keeping the needs of mum, unborn or breastfed baby at the front of our mind, and also the impact on the social network. It's not just the suffering woman who's impacted by this terrible business. As you can imagine, Daksha Emson's family are changed forever. Her husband has actually done a lot of campaigning and is partially responsible for the improvement in our services since the tragic death of his wife. Oh, sorry, the point about the stigma, I suppose, and Daksha's story is that if a woman who is a trained psychiatrist with a bipolar disorder can't seek help postnatally, which she couldn't for various reasons, largely stigma. She thought she was going to have her baby taken away from her. She thought she was never going to get another job. She thought because she was becoming psychotic that she was a bad person and the world was an evil place. If she can't seek help, what hope is there for somebody who's got much more negative views of mental health services, of social services who do remove children disproportionately from minority ethnic communities? There's lots and lots of reasons why people don't seek help, and so it's a terribly important thing to keep talking about all these sorts of things. But in terms of all mental illness, not just psychosis, there are lots of reasons to treat it, obviously. There's just a lot of suffering and poorer obstetric outcomes if we don't treat women with mental illness in the perinatal period. Right, how are we doing for time? Not too bad. The treatment's not simple. 10, oh great. We're doing really fine. The treatment isn't as straightforward, unfortunately, as one pill for one thing and one for another. Apart from anything else, there are pills that shouldn't be taken at all when you're pregnant. For example, sodium valproate. I was recently, very luckily, in China and delivering a similar sort of talk to a hospital in Beijing. And one of the questions that I've been asked to answer is what drugs are safe to prescribe in pregnancy. This is when I was preparing the talk, and it did make me smile because it's one of those real irritations to a perinatal psychiatrist. This idea that you can just dish out the sertraline from, any old clinic because it'll all be fine. And so I wrote the slightly stroppy email back, poor Paula, who's also had stroppy emails from me, slightly stroppy email back going, actually, there's no drugs that are safe to prescribe in pregnancy. We just have to make sure that the benefits outweigh the risks, which is the case for all medical treatments, right? And it's definitely the case for HRT and everything else, It's, but the NICE guidelines say very clearly that unless it's absolutely necessary, we don't prescribe sodium valproate anymore. And you would be surprised. I mean, for me, we've been saying this for ages, right? Like for 20 years we've been saying this, but actually it's in the NICE Guidelines 2014, which have been updated in 2018, I think, also I can remember the update. But the updated guidelines state very clearly, don't do this thing. Do not give sodium valproate to anybody of childbearing age. We're not just talking about pregnant women, we're talking about women who can conceive, because of course it's too late by the time you've discovered you're pregnant to find out that you shouldn't be taking sodium valproate. And sodium valproate is used as a mood stabilizer, just for, sorry to keep having to refer back to people who are not psychiatrists. It's also taken for epilepsy, which is a different situation altogether. So I'm not talking about women with epilepsy who need valproate, although the risks, unfortunately, are still the same, and they are high. Instead, what we like to do is provide specialised psychological treatments, because those are much more harm-free. And perinatal psychiatry is wonderful because we've got people who do things like infant mental health, which always makes me smile as a sort of concept, but is actually totally fantastic, because what happens when you look after a baby before it's born and within the first year is extraordinary. And there's a data set from Bristol called ALSPAC, which lots of people will be aware of, the Avon Longitudinal Parents and Children data set from children of the 90s, I think it was known, which sort of demonstrates things like if you don't treat women with anxiety and depression during pregnancy, those kids are getting worse GCSE results. Do you know what I mean? We've got absolutely hard evidence. Those kids are in their 20s and 30s now. The impact is long term. So that feeds into an economic argument, actually, for providing treatment, because this is causing society a lot of harm. So we need to think about psychological treatments, social interventions, and of course, always do it all within a cultural and political context. And having heard all the talks so far before the break, I'm not going to labour this because it's sort of like pushing at an open door. It's wonderful having an audience that actually gets what you're trying to say. What was quite funny when I was talking in Beijing was that the hospital director my friend who had invited me, told me I had to take the word political out of my talk because he said they'll think you mean something else. So I said, oh, all right, and we called it social or something. Anyway, so politics obviously are ubiquitous in the whole of life, but particularly in healthcare and social care and everything we're talking about today, women's rights, actually, human rights. And so I don't need to say very much about gender politics, which is actually the reason I became a perinatal psychiatrist. I've said a variety of different things to different people depending on which job I'm applying for. But the reality of why I became a perinatal psychiatrist is because the politics of women's health really matters to me. And so, of course, I've got quite a lot of experience in working with communities in which we have to be mindful of risks related to domestic violence, we have to think about the impact of poverty, we have to think about lots of different things. I am actually coming to the end because I've sort of been steaming through to try and do this quickly. This is the hopeful bit. So this amazing map is produced by the UK Maternal Mental Health Alliance, and it shows you that in 2014 there were various bits of London that are red that didn't really have perinatal mental health services. But by the time the map was redrawn earlier this year, we've got decent perinatal mental health services across the whole of London. Now, if that is not a good news story, I don't know what is. And I mean, there's lots of things there's a long way to go, but I think it's really important to know that all the work that the people who we've been hearing earlier this afternoon do, from Baroness Udin right the way through, everybody, all the campaigning, all the activism, it's worth it, because occasionally we make a huge difference in an area, and I'm very grateful to have been in a specialty that's just been, it's been a phenomenal sort of few years of working within this world. Because I would say that, psychiatry is obviously the best specialty out of all the medical specialties. I'm sure I don't need to persuade anybody here, but despite the fact that we won't go into all the disadvantages of being a psychiatrist. But perinatal psychiatry in particular is a very hopeful specialty. A lot of the disorders, common though they are so treatable. It's so That was when I was practicing, and I was aware that I was okay for time, and I should probably talk about the sort of more common and the more treatable conditions, but we can come back to that later. But the point is, there's a lot that can be done, and it really reduces suffering, so it's a great thing to be doing as a clinician. But as a psychiatrist, I know, don't I just, about stigma and about what might happen if we don't talk. So, again, everything that I've heard so far this afternoon has been about opening channels of communication. It's about starting and continuing this conversation. It's about the change that can be achieved by talking. And psychoeducation, of course. Telling people about the benefits of treatment, persuading people, as has happened with the UK Maternal Mental Health Alliance, that it is going to benefit not just the poor little babies, which is one of those expressions that drives me nuts, that sort of thing. Oh, you're a perinatal psychiatrist. Oh, that must be nice. All the little babies, it drives me, sorry. It's economically terribly important to everybody, even the men. So we've come a long way. We've come such a long way, we've got men in the audience, so I mustn't be rude, and I don't mean to be. But we've got a long way to go. It's all very well having those wonderful green maps, but we have got to train a lot of people because we haven't fully staffed all those lovely services yet. Perinatal psychiatry, beyond all else, is all about empowerment, putting the women with lived experience at the centre of our services, which is something I feel incredibly strongly about, and I'm so grateful that the FGM person, Juliet, put service users at the front, the middle, and the end of everything we do. And perinatal psychiatry does that. I'm very proud to say I've always worked very closely with people with lived experience. But we've still got a long way to go. There's a lot of lip service paid to that sort of endeavour, and it is quite hard to carry on doing that because we still talk badly of people with mental health problems. We've also got a long way to go within the world, and I want to finish by telling you guys about the International Marseille Society, which is also being supported by Leigh day to day. So although I didn't manage to make it clear enough, that's where the proceeds from my lecture are going to go, in order to continue the seed funding of this other amazing organisation called the Global Alliance for Maternal Mental Health. It's not amazing yet because we're still at the very, very beginning, and it's not actually a registered charity, but what we actually want to do, the Global Alliance for Maternal Mental Health, that does have a website, is we want to campaign much more widely to get organisations like the WHO, like the UN, to put perinatal mental health targets as part of, sort of what we should be aiming to do in the world. Daksha Empson hasn't... I hate all these expressions of dying in vain and all that sort of stuff. It's just awful, awful thing to talk about. But the point is that she lost her life. Her family lost her, and Freya is the baby's name. And there are things that have happened subsequent to that perhaps make a bit more sense of some of that tragedy, but we can prevent the ones in the future, some of them, okay? So some resources, some references, some things to keep people going. The one that hasn't hit this slide that I forgot to put on, but I will just tell anybody who's interested, is Tommy's. So the Tommy's charity has got the most fantastic information about all the different sorts of perinatal mental illnesses and treatments and service. It's got a lot of fantastic information about all the things that people want to ask about, what drugs are safe and everything else. Okay, thank you very much.